Good day, everyone, and welcome to Unit 4, Theory of Demand. Demand is one of the most fundamental concepts in economics because it explains how consumers make purchasing decisions and how markets function. Every day, individuals decide what to buy, how much to buy, and when to buy. These decisions collectively influence prices, production, and the allocation of resources in an economy. In this unit, we will study the meaning of demand, understand the law of demand, distinguish between individual demand and market demand, and learn how consumers' decisions shape the overall market. We will also examine the factors that influence demand and understand why demand plays such an important role in determining market prices. By the end of this lecture, you will have a clear understanding of the theory of demand and its practical application in everyday economic life. Let us begin by understanding why demand is considered the foundation of a market economy. Let us begin our discussion by understanding why demand is considered the engine of a market economy. Every economic activity begins with demand. Producers manufacture goods and services because consumers are willing to purchase them. Similarly, businesses decide what to produce, how much to produce, and even what price to charge after analyzing the demand for their products. Therefore, demand acts as a signal that guides production, investment, employment, and the allocation of resources in an economy. In our daily lives, we constantly make decisions based on our needs, preferences, and financial capacity. For example, when purchasing a smartphone, we compare prices, features, and our available budget before making a decision. Likewise, a family may decide to purchase more fruits and vegetables if prices fall, or postpone buying expensive electronic goods if prices rise. These simple decisions reflect the concept of demand in economics. However, economists do not view demand merely as a desire to own a product. Millions of people may wish to own a luxury car, but only those who are willing and financially able to purchase it create actual demand. Thus, demand represents a combination of desire, purchasing power, and willingness to buy. Understanding consumer behavior is important not only for businesses, but also for governments. Firms study demand to plan production, launch new products, and develop pricing strategies. Governments analyze demand while designing taxation policies, subsidy programs, and public welfare measures. Accurate demand analysis helps maintain market stability and supports economic planning. For this reason, the theory of demand forms one of the basic foundations of microeconomics. Once we understand how demand works, it becomes much easier to explain market prices, consumer choices, and the interaction between buyers and sellers. In the next slide, we will study the concept overview and understand the true economic meaning of demand and the factors that influence consumers' purchasing decisions. Before studying the law of demand, it is important to understand what economists actually mean by the term demand. In everyday language, people often use the words want and demand interchangeably, but in economics, these two concepts are quite different. A want simply means a desire to own or consume a product. For example, many people may want to buy the latest smartphone, a luxury watch, or an expensive car. However, having a desire alone does not create demand. In economics, demand refers to the quantity of a commodity that consumers are willing and able to purchase at different prices during a given period of time. Therefore, demand is always related to price, and it represents a measurable relationship between price and quantity demanded. This is why the slide describes demand as a functional relationship between the price of a good and the quantity consumers purchase. As prices change, consumers usually change the quantity they buy. Understanding this relationship helps economists predict consumer behavior and market outcomes. Demand also plays a central role in resource allocation. Producers observe the demand for different products before deciding what to manufacture. If the demand for electric vehicles increases, automobile companies invest more in producing electric cars. Similarly, if consumers demand healthier food products, companies expand their production of organic and nutritious foods. Thus, demand guides producers in allocating resources efficiently. The slide also mentions that demand is influenced by both economic and psychological factors. Economic factors include income, prices of related goods, and purchasing power. Psychological factors include tastes, preferences, fashion trends, advertisements, and consumer expectations. Sometimes people purchase a product not because they need it, but because it has become fashionable or is strongly promoted through advertising. Finally, demand forms the foundation of price determination. Prices in a market are largely determined through the interaction of demand and supply. If demand increases while supply remains unchanged, prices generally rise. On the other hand, if demand decreases, prices tend to fall. Thus, understanding the concept of demand is essential for analyzing consumer behavior, market trends, and business decisions. In the next slide, we will discuss the learning objectives of this unit and understand what concepts we are expected to master by the end of this lesson. Before we move into the detailed concepts of demand, let us first understand the learning objectives of this unit. These objectives provide a clear roadmap of what you are expected to learn and achieve by the end of this lesson. The first objective is to define demand. We will understand the difference between a simple desire and actual demand. In economics, not every desire becomes demand. A person must not only want a product, but should also have the ability and willingness to purchase it at a given price. This distinction is one of the most fundamental concepts in microeconomics. The second objective is to identify the determinants of demand. Demand does not depend only on price. It is influenced by several other factors such as consumer income, tastes and preferences, prices of related goods, population, expectations about future prices, and even advertising. Understanding these factors helps us explain why demand for a product may increase or decrease even when its price remains unchanged. The third objective is to understand the law of demand, which is one of the basic laws of economics. We will study why consumers generally buy more of a product when its price falls and buy less when its price rises, assuming all other factors remain constant. We will also understand the logic behind this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Finally, we will learn about market aggregation. Every consumer has individual preferences and purchasing decisions. When the demands of all consumers are combined, they form the market demand for a product. This concept helps businesses estimate total demand and enables governments to make better economic policies. By achieving these objectives, you will be able to explain consumer behavior, interpret demand curves, analyze market situations, and apply the theory of demand to practical business and economic decisions. Now that we understand the goals of this unit, let us move to the next section and study the meaning of demand in detail. Let us now understand the meaning of demand, which is one of the most important concepts in microeconomics. In our daily lives, we often say that we demand a product simply because we want it. However, in economics, demand has a much more specific meaning. Demand is the quantity of a commodity that a consumer is willing and able to purchase at a given price during a given period of time. This definition highlights three important conditions that must be satisfied before a want becomes demand. These are desire, ability to pay, and willingness to pay. First is desire. A consumer must have the wish or need to own a product. For example, many people may desire to own a luxury car or the latest smartphone. However, desire alone does not create demand because it does not guarantee that the consumer can actually purchase the product. The second condition is ability to pay. The consumer must have sufficient income or purchasing power to buy the product. A student may wish to buy an expensive laptop, but if they do not have the necessary funds, that desire cannot be considered demand. The third condition is willingness to pay. Even if a person has enough money, they may decide not to buy the product because they do not feel it is worth the price or they prefer to spend their money elsewhere. Therefore, willingness to purchase is equally important. The slide summarizes this concept through a simple equation. Demand equals desire plus ability to pay plus willingness to pay at a given price and time. It is also important to remember that demand always refers to a specific price and a specific period of time. For example, the demand for umbrellas may increase during the rainy season, while the demand for air conditioners may increase during summer. Similarly, if the price of a product changes, the quantity demanded may also change. Therefore, demand is not merely a wish to own something. It is an effective desire backed by purchasing power and the willingness to spend money. Now that we understand the meaning of demand, let us move to the next slide, where we will study the graphical representation of demand and understand how economists illustrate the relationship between price and quantity demanded using a demand curve. After understanding the meaning of demand, let us see how economists represent demand graphically through the demand curve. A demand curve is a graphical representation that shows the relationship between the price of a commodity and the quantity demanded by consumers. It helps us understand how consumers respond when the price of a product changes. In this graph, the vertical axis, or y-axis, represents the price of the commodity, while the horizontal axis, or x-axis, represents the quantity demanded. Each point on the demand curve shows the quantity of the product that consumers are willing to purchase at a particular price. One of the most important characteristics of the demand curve is that it slopes downward from left to right. This downward slope indicates an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. In simple words, when the price of a product decreases, consumers usually buy more of it. On the other hand, when the price increases, consumers tend to buy less. For example, imagine the price of a packet of biscuits falls from 40 Indian rupees to 30 Indian rupees. Many consumers may purchase 2 or 3 packets instead of 1 because the product has become more affordable. However, if the price increases to 50 Indian rupees, some consumers may reduce their purchases or switch to a cheaper alternative. The demand curve is one of the most widely used tools in economics because it helps businesses estimate customer demand, assists governments in policy decisions, and enables economists to analyze market behavior. However, it is important to remember that the demand curve assumes all other factors remain constant. If consumer income, tastes, or prices of related goods change, the demand curve itself may shift. We will study these factors in later sections. Now that we understand the graphical representation of demand, let us move to the next slide and study the law of demand, which explains why the demand curve slopes downward. One of the most fundamental principles of economics is the law of demand. This law explains how consumers generally react to changes in the price of a commodity. The law states that other things remaining constant, as the price of a commodity falls, the quantity demanded increases, and as the price rises, the quantity demanded decreases. This is known as the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. The phrase ceteris paribus, mentioned on the slide, is a Latin term that means all other things remaining the same. It means that while studying the effect of price on demand, we assume that other factors such as consumer income, tastes, population, and prices of related goods do not change. Why does this inverse relationship exist? The first reason is that when the price of a product falls, it becomes more affordable. Consumers can now purchase larger quantities with the same amount of money. For example, if the price of a notebook decreases from 100 Indian rupees to 80 Indian rupees, many students may buy extra notebooks because they are now cheaper. The second reason is that when the price increases, consumers try to reduce their purchases or shift to cheaper alternatives. For instance, if the price of butter rises sharply, some consumers may buy margarine instead because it is less expensive. This behavior is observed in the case of most normal goods, which is why the demand curve slopes downward from left to right. However, it is important to remember that the law of demand applies only when other factors remain unchanged. If consumers' income changes, or if their tastes and preferences change, the demand pattern may also change even if the price remains the same. Thus, the law of demand provides the basic foundation for understanding consumer behavior, pricing decisions, and market analysis. In the next section, we will move from the concept of demand to individual and market demand, where we will understand how the purchasing decisions of a single consumer combine to form the total demand in a market. After understanding the law of demand, let us now study two important concepts: individual demand and market demand. Although these concepts are related, they differ in terms of scope and application. Individual demand refers to the quantity of a commodity that a single consumer is willing and able to purchase at different prices during a given period. Every consumer has unique preferences, income levels, and purchasing habits. Therefore, the demand of one individual may be very different from that of another. For example, a college student may buy 2 notebooks every month, while another student may buy 5 notebooks because of different academic needs. Similarly, a person with a higher income may purchase premium products, whereas someone with a lower income may choose more affordable alternatives. Thus, individual demand depends on factors such as income, tastes, preferences, and personal needs. On the other hand, Market demand refers to the total quantity of a product demanded by all consumers in the market at various prices during a given period. It is obtained by adding together the individual demands of all consumers. In economics, this is known as the horizontal summation of individual demand curves. For instance, if 1,000 consumers each demand 1 liter of milk per day, the market demand for milk becomes 1,000 liters per day. Therefore, market demand gives producers a broader picture of consumer demand in the entire market. Businesses are generally more interested in market demand because it helps them estimate total sales, plan production, manage inventories, and develop pricing strategies. Governments also use market demand data while framing economic policies and forecasting future consumption patterns. The quotation on the slide beautifully summarizes this idea. Markets are simply the sum of all individual voices and choices. Every consumer's buying decision may seem small, but when millions of such decisions are combined, they determine the overall demand in the market. In the next slide, we will compare individual demand and market demand in a tabular form and understand their major differences more clearly.
Okay, now let's understand what individual demand is. So, to understand individual demand, one must understand it very clearly that individual demand is the demand uh, direction shown by the single buyer. Okay, whatever a single buyer does, or at what price, how much quantity a single buyer is showing, is demanding, is asking for, is going to buy, is going to represent, is actually individual demand. So in the next slide we'll see about market, what market demand is actually. So market demand is all about a series of individuals living in a society. It's a collective demand that is being that is being represented by a collection of people living in a society. So the demand in too many individuals demands altogether from the market demand. So individual demand refers to the quantity of commodity that a single consumer is willing and able to buy at a various prices during a specific period, and it focuses on personal utility driven by individual income and is subject to personal tastes. So all these are characteristics of individual demand. So in order to understand individual demand, it is very important to understand that individual demand is all about the utility of look, whenever we are talking about demand, we should understand what utility is. Okay, because demand is directly related to utility, because unless a person finds any utility in a particular commodity, he is not going to demand for that commodity in the market. So this is the thing that one should keep in mind. And this utility is subjective, that means it depends on the consumer. It differs from consumer to consumer. So this utility is subjective, and also this individual demand is also subjective. Individual demand is also subjective in nature. So these things are all about individual demand. Now let's move to market demand. So as you know, what is market demand? So now talking about market demand. So market demand is aggregate behavior, as I said in the previous slide, that individual demand, a series of individual demands. That means individual demand is about a particular person, but when we talk about market demand is all about a series of individual demands clubbed all together. That means it's the collective demand of a society as a whole. Because if you are talking about a market, so market cannot be of a one person. That means a series of person will go there, individual will go there to get commodities that will satisfy their needs. So the demand, total wholesome demand of all these individual demands will be called market demand. So you can see here it's written here, it's aggregate behavior. Market demand is the total quantity of commodity that all consumers in the market are willing and able to purchase at different prices during given time. It represents the horizontal summation of individual demand and individual demand curves. So markets are simply the sum of individual voices and choices. So let's move to the next slide and see what's all about.
Having understood the concepts of individual demand and market demand, Let us now compare them side by side. This comparison helps us clearly understand how these two concepts differ in terms of scope, purpose, and application. The first point of comparison is scope. Individual demand relates to a single consumer. It studies the purchasing behavior of one person or one household. In contrast, market demand covers all consumers in the market. It represents the combined demand of thousands or even millions of buyers. The second difference is how they are derived. Individual demand is based on a consumer's personal preferences, income, and purchasing decisions. Market demand, however, is obtained by adding the individual demand curves of all consumers at each price level. This process is known as the horizontal summation of individual demand curves. The third point is the factors influencing demand. Individual demand is mainly affected by personal income, tastes, preferences, habits, and lifestyle. Market demand depends on broader factors such as population size, income distribution, consumer preferences, and overall economic conditions. Finally, their purpose is different. Individual demand helps us understand the behavior of a particular consumer, while market demand is useful for businesses and governments. Companies use market demand to estimate sales, plan production, determine pricing strategies, and forecast future demand. Governments use it to formulate economic policies, estimate consumption, and plan resource allocation. In simple terms, individual demand explains the behavior of one buyer, whereas market demand reflects the behavior of the entire market. Understanding both concepts is essential because every market begins with individual consumers, and together their purchasing decisions determine the total demand for a product. With this, we conclude our discussion on the theory of demand. In the next unit, we will build upon these concepts and study elasticity of demand, where we will analyze how responsive consumers are to changes in price, income, and other factors. Thank you for your attention.